My name is Eric Basta, Business Development Manager for NHMEP, New Hampshire Manufacturing Extension Partnership. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Cybersecurity for DoD Manufacturers. First slide page. So we offer services, NHMEP offers services in 3 key areas. For product development, we work closely with the UNH College of Engineering for designing, developing, and manufacturing new products. We improve manufacturing processes by offering training in Lean, Six Sigma, ISO, geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and plant layout, just to name a few. And we also help manufacturers reposition their business model to find new clients with our business growth in training, in the areas of training in marketing and sales. Next slide. So the New Hampshire Manufacturing Extension Partnership is one of the nationwide system of MEP centers linked through the U.S. Department of Commerce and NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. There's at least one MEP center located in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and we're able to leverage a vast array of public and private resources and services that are available to every manufacturing enterprise in the state. Our mission is simple. We help manufacturers in New Hampshire improve their productivity, compete globally, and keep jobs in the state. And next slide. And as you can see on the slide, MEP's worked with over 700 New Hampshire manufacturers and touched over 11,000 employees who have gone through our manufacturing training programs. Our services consist of 3 major areas. The first one you can see is operational excellence. That's where we offer training on Lean, Six Sigma, plant layout, blueprint reading, geometric dimensioning and tolerancing, and lean and green energy services. The second area is workforce development. Here we're part of the Sector Partnership Initiative, that's called SPI, where we work with middle schools, high schools, community colleges, and manufacturers to build a future workforce in New Hampshire. Every year we put on Manufacturing Month, and during Manufacturing Month, we coordinate school visits to manufacturers in the hope that some students will make manufacturing a career. Last year we had 1,605 students visit 45 New Hampshire manufacturers, and keeping with workforce, we provide leadership training, team building, and problem solving, technical skills training, and training within industry. The third area is innovative growth strategies. We offer the Sales Training Collaborative, a custom sales training program, web and SEO improvement services, and the Marketing Collaborative program. We also offer quality management system training, which includes the various ISO standards. We have food safety training, technology-driven market intelligence, or we call it TDMI, as well as the topic of today's webinar, CMMC Level 3 Cybersecurity Assessments for manufacturing contractors and subcontractors who perform work for the U.S. Department of Defense. And next slide.
There we go. Sorry.
Thank you, Paige, for doing it for me. As for NHMEP's economic impact, after our clients have gone through one of our training programs, NIST MEP, which is where we get partial funding, requires us to have the client fill out an impact survey. As you can see from the slide, it shows you the compiled economic impact we have received from our clients during the last 3 years. Next slide. And we have partnered with Mainstay Technologies since 2018 and have served together over 35 clients in New Hampshire. We continue to move forward with helping New Hampshire manufacturers and working with our partner, Mainstay Technologies, which now I would like to introduce you to Paige Yater, Director of Information Security Program Management for Mainstay Technologies, our partner. So now I'll turn things over to Paige.
Thanks, Eric. Good morning, everyone. As Eric said, my name is Paige Yater. I am the Director of Information Security Program Management here at Mainstay, and I am happy to be here with you today talking about CMMC. We have lots to cover. I wanted to give you just a couple of quick pieces of information. So I will pause throughout. I've got the question and answer screen up as well. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, just put them in that Q&A. I will pause for questions at various points throughout the presentation. But really the goal here today is for me to give you kind of an overview. We'll talk about a variety of different things. Mainstay as a whole is an IT and information security company. We do full outsourced IT. We do full outsourced information security. And we've spent a really significant amount of time in the last probably 18 months learning about CMMC, following its progression. And that's why we're here today and why we're partnering with NHMEP. So happy to have you all with me this morning. So we're going to talk about 5 different areas. We're going to talk about, first of all, how we got here. So I don't know how many of you know the context of CMMC. I don't know how many of you know the context of what we had before CMMC or what we currently have. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the regulations, terms, and timelines, just to level set on the information itself. We'll talk a little bit about the assessment process so that you're aware of what that process is going to look like when it's time for you to go through it. Then we'll talk in detail about the domains, capabilities, and practices. So this is where we'll get into the more technical piece of the presentation, but we're trying to keep it really sort of business focused so that you understand from a business perspective what these requirements are. So we'll get into the expectations, we'll break it out by level. And then the last part is just some things for you to consider. So what should you do next? What should you be thinking about now? What is your future sort of roadmap looking like in order to get yourself from where you are today to where you need to be for CMMC? So we're starting with how we got here. So cybersecurity is a thing. You guys have probably all heard about this. If you read any news article, there's probably a really likely chance that you're going to find an article that has something to do with ransomware or a cyber attack of some kind, information getting lost or stolen. There's a variety of different things. In the supply chain specifically, however, we have a significant issue because the supply chain for the US government is so massive, and the volume and the value of the information that flows through that supply chain is really significant. You can see that second section there, the cost worldwide for cybercrime specific to the supply chain is about $600 billion. It's a big problem. It's a big pain point. It's a lot of money to be lost to crime, to cybercrime specifically. Currently, there are challenges with self-attestation. So organizations in the supply chain are supposed to be self-attesting that they are aligned with 800-171, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But organizations are attesting to the fact that they are compliant, and that is actually not true. Part of that is not because organizations are intentionally dishonest, but because it's a complex framework. There's a lot of things to think about. There's a lot of information that needs to be considered, and a lot of organizations don't specialize in this. That's not what you're in business to do, and as a result, asking you to self-attest is definitely a challenge, and it's been a challenge. So we continue to see that challenge. We're also in a place where organizations have attested to being compliant with the current framework, which is NIST 800-171, and have actually been proven not to be compliant because they have experienced a breach or information has gotten lost or stolen. And as a result, the US government has started filing lawsuits, leveraging the False Claims Act to hold those organizations accountable for falsely identifying themselves as compliant. So the government is really stepping up their focus on this. They're really stepping up how they're holding individuals accountable. And that's really a lot of where CMMC came from. So the other piece, the last piece here, is lack of requirement distinction. So if you're an organization that is a small organization, you're getting some contract information, you're getting really sort of general, fairly broad information, you have the same 110 requirements as someone who is getting really, really sensitive, controlled unclassified information that could be leveraged to steal some intellectual property, to steal some government, whatever, tanks, helicopters, missiles, whatever. And so there's a disparity there. And so there's no ability to hold those two organizations to the same standard. I mean, that's what we're trying to do right now, but it's not working. So we're trying to make sure that we're adjusting accordingly. So CMMC as a whole addresses these challenges. So first of all, it strengthens the requirements. It establishes levels. So it creates a disparity between level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and level 5. So there are 5 levels total. We're going to talk mostly today about level 1, 2, and 3. We will touch on level 4 and 5, but for the most part, we will go into levels 1 through 3. And there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It also implements a clear auditing process. It also implements clear ownership of that auditing process. So making sure that each individual organization is aligned to these standards and that they're being assessed and that we're confirming as the US government, they're confirming that these practices are in place. So right now we have NIST 800-171. Organizations can say whether or not they're compliant, right? Organizations who don't specialize in cybersecurity are saying, yes, we think we're good, we're not sure. CMMC takes that self-attestation away and requires organizations to go through an actual assessment and accreditation process. All right, so let's talk about the regulation itself and go into some terms and some concepts. So I've touched on some of this already, but NIST 800-171 is what we currently have. NIST 800-171 allows for self-attestation and has 110 requirements. We're moving to CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It has 5 maturity levels. Self-attestation is no longer allowed. And it covers 2 different kinds of information. So we're now differentiating. So we created those maturity levels and we're separating out the type of information. So in the example I gave earlier, we had 2 different organizations, one that was getting primarily contract information and one that was getting controlled and classified information. So this actually separates those 2. And if you're just getting contract information, you have a lower set of requirements, a lower lift when it comes to your cybersecurity standards than somebody who is holding controlled and classified information. So that's going to be a really important distinction as we're going through this process, and as you as organizations are going through this process, you should start to really think about what information you have. Look at what documentation you're getting, look at who you're getting it from, look at what's included in it. We'll talk a little bit about those definitions in just a moment, but that's going to be a really important distinction because really the short version is that it's going to be the difference between having 17 practices that you have to align with and 130. So it's a big point of focus. We want to make sure that we're really clear on what information we have. The CMMC framework is made up of 17 domains, 43 different capabilities, and 171 total practices between level 1 and level 5. Contracts with CMMC as a requirement are going to be rolled out between this year, 2021, and 2025. And then by the beginning of 2026, the expectation is that all new DoD contracts will have the CMMC requirement in it. So that doesn't mean that we can wait until 2026 to get certified. That means that between now and the end of 2025, we're going to slowly start seeing contracts with these requirements. So where you are in that process is currently unknown, depending on what type of work you do, depending on what programs you're part of, depending on how things are getting flowed down in your portion of the supply chain. All of those things will have factors as to when you actually need to be certified, but it will happen sometime, likely at this point, sometime between 2022 and 2025. So just keep that in mind. So from a terms perspective, we have 2 different sets of terms that I want to talk about. So the first is that data. So this whole framework is predicated on the data that you are holding. So the first type of data is federal contract information. So this data is information that's not intended for public release. It's provided by or generated for the government and is tied to a specific contract. It could include transactional information, payment processing, contract specifications, timelines, that type of thing. Controlled unclassified information, on the other hand, has a much more sort of broad definition, but in the National Archives, which I'll show you the link to in just a second, but in the National Archives, it does define what controlled unclassified information is. And this is typically things like schematics, test results, user guides, training manuals, photos, that type of thing. This is information that is considered controlled, but doesn't rise to the level of classified information. There was an executive order under the Obama administration, Executive Order 13526, which actually is what created this controlled unclassified information designation. Prior to that, we had things like for official use only and secret and that kind of thing. So we had different data classifications. There was a variety of them, depending on what type of, or what branch of the Department of Defense you were working with. So this executive order consolidated everything into controlled and classified information. So I highly recommend you take some time and go to the National Archives and look at that CUI definition. That will help clarify for you whether or not you have CUI in your information system. The second piece we have here are just the phraseology that we're going to be using when we talk about the framework itself. So domains, there are 17 domains within CMMC, and these are going to be things like account controls and incident response. So they're broad level topics that tie directly to cybersecurity. Capabilities within that are just a sub level that says, do we have the ability to document this? Do we have the ability to test this? Do we have the ability to put this in place? Practices are the very specific pieces that we're talking about. So when we talk about 130 practices, these are the things that very specifically say, limit access to only those users that need it, right? That's a very specific practice. And then processes are the measurement of, it's part of the measurement of maturity, but this is tied to, from a process perspective, we're looking at policy. So we'll start at the bottom. So procedure, which is a very detailed step-by-step how you're doing certain things, the policy that guides how those procedures work, and then the plan, which talks about how we're implementing all of the policies and making sure that these are all happening within the organization. So we have practices, which are the really specific how we're actually doing things, and then the processes are tied to the policies, procedures, and plans that define and document how the organization manages its program. So that'll become a little bit more clear as we go a little bit further into this. So just a different viewpoint if you're a visual learner like I am, sometimes it's nice to see that hierarchy. So this is generally how this works. So within the domains, we've got capabilities and practices, and then we're also assessing processes to go with it. So just a little bit of history. So where we started and where we are in this sort of progression. So in January 2022, there was a board of directors that established an accreditation body. So the CMMC accreditation body was created at about the same time that the version 1 of CMMC was released. So CMMC has been pulled together by the Department of Defense. So DoD has pulled together this framework. They have worked with an organization, which is now called the CMMC accreditation body, to be the independent assessing organization to make sure that organizations are aligning with CMMC. So DoD created the framework, handed it off to CMMC AB. The AB is responsible for making sure that organizations are getting certified and that all of that information is being tracked. So it's not the DoD that's actually doing any of the certification or assessment work. In mid to late 2020, we had the initial set of certified third-party assessing organizations. So we'll go into some detail about what those folks are. And some training, initial training for registered practitioners was rolled out in September. So we started identifying the organizations in the industry that are going to start doing the assessment and the consulting and the preparation for these CMMC assessments. In late 2020, there were some updates to some DFARS clauses. The CMMC rulemaking was completed November 30th, I think, of 2020. And there were 3 new clauses created. One that allows for your 800-171 self-attestation, or requires your 800-171 self-attestation to be put into the SPRS database. So SPRS, you probably heard of that at some point since November of last year. The second one is tied to, if you are an organization with a higher level of information, that controlled and classified information, it does give the government, the DCMA, I think specifically, the ability to come in and actually do an audit for 800-171. So it's sort of an add-on clause that says, the original clause is self-attestation, but we're going to tack on a bonus feature that says we can actually assess you, which was nice of them. And then the third one, the 7021, is actually the new CMMC requirement. So we haven't seen that come in any live contracts at this point, but that is the clause that you'll be seeing as you move forward in the process. And then in the first half of 2021, the initial set of C3PAOs have been approved. Initial training programs are defined, and they're really at the point now where they're going to start to put this whole thing out into the wild. So it's been a development process up to this point. There's been a lot of foundational building, and they're getting ready to roll this out into the wild, if you will. So we'll talk about C3PAOs in just a second. One thing that I do want to point out is that every organization should have been aligned with NIST 800-171 no later than December 31st of 2017. So if you are an organization who has had that requirement, there's definitely going to be an expectation that you are pretty far along in the process of getting to CMMC. The level 3 certification for CMMC requires all of the 800-171 controls. They're all rolled into that level 3. So there is an expectation that most organizations are pretty far along in this process. So that's just something for you to be aware of as you're working through this process as an organization. Okay, so resources. So one really, really great thing, if you have done any work with 800-171, or if you've had the opportunity to do any sort of 800-171 assessment, you probably know that the documentation associated with 800-171 was mediocre at best. My opinion, maybe some of you love it, but it wasn't great. It wasn't super helpful. It wasn't very user-friendly. Some of it was hard to find. It was pretty vague. So the CMMC AB and the DoD specifically, as they've been building out CMMC, have worked really, really hard to make sure that they have really good documentation. And the documentation is fantastic, in my opinion, compared to what we were dealing with 800-171. So I'm going to show you just a couple of quick things. So we'll make this PowerPoint available to everybody so that you have these links. But so the CMMC AB has a website. This website is updated regularly because they're still in the sort of building and developing process. So I would definitely bookmark this, keep an eye on it. There's a lot of really good information out here. They have done a really good job of, pulling together visuals. They have pretty good marketing. When it comes to organizations seeking certification, which is all of you, this is kind of the roadmap. So this gives you a good perspective as to what the process looks like, how things are going to happen, that type of thing. So I definitely recommend keeping this website. There's a lot of really good information here. There's also the marketplace. So I wanted to show you the marketplace because this is where you can find registered organizations like registered practitioner organizations and certified third-party assessing organizations when you are ready to do the consulting work and when you're ready to go through that assessment process. So in the marketplace, you can filter by different things. So there are 2 authorized C3PAOs right now. And then we have a bunch more, 172 that are in the process of becoming assessing organizations. We've also got a separate website, which is the CMMC model website. So this is linked to on the AB. You can actually link out here. The CMMC standard will take you to this same place. But this has all the documentation around the framework. The appendices give you a summary of each of the practices, what the expectations are. And they've also created these assessment guides. So these assessment guides are incredibly helpful. So I want to just show you really quickly this one assessment guide. So we've got, this is just the very first of the practices. So this is the level 3 assessment guide. So there are 130 practices included, but it gives you the practice information. It tells you what the objectives are of an assessment. So what is an assessment actually looking for? Then it gives you some information about how they're actually going to assess it, including examination, interview, and test, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then it gives you some discussion, which is sort of just real world talk about what are we trying to accomplish here. And then in the further discussion, it actually gives you examples, which is very, very exciting. Maybe my level of exciting is, my bar is kind of low, but it's very exciting. It gives you a lot of really good information about how you might actually implement this and what the scenario is in which this would apply and how you would apply it to your organization. So all of these documents are readily available to everyone here. So I highly recommend, this document is 430 pages long. I don't anticipate that any of you will sit down and read the whole thing, but having it as a reference guide and being able to refer back to it in certain situations will be incredibly helpful. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint here. And then we've also got the National Archives. The CUI definition here is another really good resource for you to go and look at. to see whether or not you think you might have CUI in your system versus federal contract information. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the assessment process. So we've used these acronyms a little bit, so let's talk in detail about what they are. So organizations seeking certification, this is you. Organizations who need to be certified, who need to go through this process, who want to bid on jobs as part of the DoD supply chain. If you, as we get mature with this process, right, as these contracts have these clauses that say you need to have this level of certification, you actually won't be able to bid on a job unless you have the right level of certification. So if a job is level 3 and you are only certified at level 1, you are not going to be allowed to bid on that job. So there is a very clear sort of entry point here that we need to make sure that we're meeting that minimum bar in order to bid for these jobs. There are certified assessors and certified third-party assessing organizations, so C3PAO. These are organizations that are certified by the CMMC AB to perform assessments. They are also able to do consulting for an organization to prepare them for an assessment, but a C3PAO cannot do the consulting and preparation work as well as the assessment. So if you're working with a C3PAO, if you have them do the consulting and prep work with you, then they can't actually do your assessment. You'll have to find a different C3PAO to do your assessment. So that's an important distinction so that you understand sort of who you need to be working with and what they can and can't do for you. We also have registered practitioners and registered practitioner organizations. So Mainstay is actually a registered practitioner organization. I am a registered practitioner, as are several of my colleagues. Registered practitioners are registered with the CMMC AB. We've gone through training, we've completed assessments, we've signed agreements, we are adhering to the code of conduct, and our responsibility in this process is to support that consulting. So we do the prep work. We cannot do assessments, but we can do that prep and consulting work for you. So if you are thinking about having organizations help you with both, you might want to consider using a registered practitioner organization to get the consulting work done and the prep work done and the assessment preparedness, and then use the C3PAO to go through the assessment process. If you go back out to that CMMC AB marketplace, you can also filter on registered practitioner organizations, and you can find any number of registered practitioner organizations. I think there's several hundred of them at this point, but you can find any one of those to work with you. There's tons of different options. I think we're the only RPO in New Hampshire, but I do know there are at least 1 or 2 others in the New England area. So just something to think about when you're looking at the C3PAO versus the RPO process. Really quick, you don't actually need to use an organization to consult and prepare for an assessment. If you feel confident in your abilities to assess these compliance frameworks, assess your alignment with them, gather all the evidence, you can absolutely do that. There's no requirement for you to use an organization to prepare you for an assessment, just as an FYI. So the assessment process. So you will need to determine what level of certification you want to go for. Now you can choose to go for level 1. You could choose to go for level 3, but just remember that whatever you choose to go for, that will dictate what contract level you can bid on. The assessment process will require a certified assessor to gather evidence from 3 categories. So there are 3 categories. So interview, examination, and testing. So if you say to an assessor, we are compliant with applying the principles of least privilege and role-based access to account controls. In order to evaluate that, so the assessor is going to look for an interview. They're either going to ask questions about it. They're going to do an examination of documents. Maybe they're going to look at your role-based access matrix. They're going to look at specific processes. They're going to look at whatever reporting you have, that kind of thing. And then testing, which is an actual demonstration of certain pieces. So testing, an easy example there is if you say that you have multi-factor authentication for your local access. So when you have multi-factor authentication, you can show a policy that says everybody has multi-factor authentication. You can then sit down at a computer, have someone log in and demonstrate that it forces them to do that multi-factor authentication. So any number of these or any combination of these can be used. We need a minimum of 2 pieces of evidence per practice. So 130 practices, we need 260 pieces of evidence at a minimum. And that's not to say that one piece of evidence couldn't support multiple practices. So just keep that in mind. And the maturity assessments will be completed for each practice to ensure that we've got the procedures and the policies and the plan documented as needed. Make sense? Okay. All right, so the assessment process continued. So each practice will be given a rating of met, and not applicable. So these are your only options. There's no partial compliance. There's no halfway. So you're either meeting it fully or you're not meeting it, or it's not applicable. If it's not applicable, you have to make sure that you have really solid documentation as to why it's not applicable and evidence to support that as well. So just because something's not applicable doesn't mean that you don't have to have evidence to demonstrate why that's not applicable. All practices at a given level must be assessed as met or not applicable, successfully not applicable, in order for the OSC to be certified at that level. So for example, if you have a level 3 assessment and you are missing 2 of those level 3 practices, but you have all of level 2 and all of level 1, you will get certified at a level 2. They won't give you partial credit. You can't get assessed at a level 3. Now, there may be an opportunity for you to do some remediation depending on where the gaps are. And what we're understanding is that the assessors will give you 90 days to remediate if possible. And then they will come back and reassess. Once the assessment work is complete, the C3PAO as an organization will review the work of the assessor and make sure that the organization itself is supporting the work of the assessor and that they feel confident in whatever the recommendation is. Then the C3PAO will go to the AB and say, we've assessed this individual organization. We believe that they should be certified at a level 3. The CMMCAB will go through and do a quality check on that. They'll make sure that they agree with that there's nothing that they would question or challenge, and then you'll be granted that certification. So it's a multi-step process. There's a lot of open questions about how long that process is going to take. A lot of it depends on the size and complexity of your organization and the level at which you want to get certified. Obviously, a level 1 certification will be a lot faster than a level 3 if we're looking at 17 practices versus 130. So all of that, keep that in mind. Now we're going to go into the domains, capabilities, and practices. So I'm going to pause there. I don't see any questions, but if anybody has any questions, let me know. I'm going to give you guys just a second to process everything I just said. It's a lot. I get it. Okay. I don't see any questions coming in. All right, here we go. Domains, capabilities, and practices. So as I mentioned, we have 5 levels. Level 1 is considered basic cyber hygiene. This is basic safeguarding of federal contract information. So again, it all goes back to the data. Depending on what you have, this will determine what information or what level of compliance you need to be at. So level 1, basic safeguarding. Level 2 is considered intermediate cyber hygiene. Now, what we're hearing from the AB is that certifications are only going to be granted at level 1, level 3, and level 5. Level 2 and level 4 are considered interim or stepping stone levels. So in this case, level 2 is a transition step. So level 2, you could go through a certification process at level 2 to make sure that you have everything at level 2 before you progress to level 3. But contracts will be written so that you need a level 1, a level 3, or a level 5 assessment. The transition here, we'll talk about the breakdown between level 1, level 2, and level 3. But the expectation is that level 3 then is controlled unclassified information. So if you have controlled unclassified information in your information system today, then you will need to go for a level 3 certification, which includes the 800-171 practices as well as 20 bonus practices. Bonus practices are always good, right? So 20 additional practices that you'll have to align with. This goes from, so we start with basic cyber hygiene, intermediate cyber hygiene is that transition step, and then level 3 is considered good cyber hygiene. And this includes assessment and adherence of controls all the way through a full continuous monitoring program. So we're getting into a more mature information security program at this point. Level 4 and level 5 are proactive and advanced progressive cybersecurity programs. We aren't going to talk much about level 4 and level 5 today. And part of that is because there's really not much happening with level 4 and level 5 at both the DoD level as well as the CMMC AB level. They're really focused on getting everybody through level 3. What we're hearing is that the expectation of the DoD is that very few organizations are actually going to need to be at level 4 and level 5. And we don't have any sort of level 5 assessment guide. We don't have any additional information other than what the original framework was rolled out as in January of 2020. So we're going to hold off on talking about level 4 and level 5. Our understanding, like I said, is that the vast majority of organizations are level 1 or level 3. So we're going to stick with those because those are likely to be the most impactful to the group that we're talking about or talking to today. Okay, so we're going to go into each one of these sections. So here's how this works. So I have 2 slides for each of the levels that we're going to talk about. The first level is, or the first slide is going to give you the information about the level. It's going to tell you how many domains and practices. It's going to give you the practice families. And then at the bottom, it's going to give you information on process maturity. So what level of process maturity you have to have in order to comply with this particular level. So starting with level 1, we've got basic cyber hygiene. We've got 6 domains and 17 practices. So the 6 domains you can see include access controls, identification and authentication, media protection, media being USBs, tablets, external hard drives, that type of thing. Physical protection, so physical facility protections, system and communications protections, and then system and information integrity. At level 1, the process maturity just needs to be performed, meaning that you need to demonstrate that you are actually performing these tasks as opposed to having a formal program, policies, or procedures in place. So at this point, just doing the right thing will get you what you need from a process maturity perspective at level 1. Okay, so now on the second slide, we've got the key components. So we're going to take those 17 practices and we're going to break them out into 3 separate categories. We've got technical, physical, and administrative. Now, this is a really important distinction for everyone to understand, and this is a topic that comes up with all of the clients that we work with. So we have this conversation a lot, but CMMC as a whole is an organizational wide, I don't want to call it a challenge because that feels like the wrong word, but it's something that is organizational wide. It's organization wide in its impact. It's organization wide in its input. And it's not something that can be solved just by the IT team. So if you are an organization or you work at an organization in which the primary responsibility for this is on the IT team, that's not necessarily bad, but please just understand that IT is not going to be able to solve this on their own. This is going to take your entire organization to successfully get to CMMC compliance, no matter what level. Doesn't matter what level, level 1, level 3, level 5, it doesn't matter. Your entire organization needs to be bought into this process, and your entire organization needs to take ownership of it. So IT is a huge part of it. We couldn't get CMMC without IT, but IT isn't the only portion that we need to be thinking about. So when we break things out into technical, physical, and administrative, we want to be thinking about the holistic organization. So when we talk about who needs to be involved from your organization, definitely IT, definitely management, whoever's responsible for budgeting, whoever's responsible for HR, whoever's responsible for finance, whoever's responsible for facilities, all of those individuals are going to have a pretty comprehensive role in making sure that we're aligning with CMMC. So just be really clear about that. Just be really thoughtful on that. Sometimes that's a culture shift for a lot of organizations. There's a lot of really great internal IT teams that have a huge amount of trust with their organization. And so leadership is just like, here you go, IT, make it happen. Because all the time when they say, here you go, IT, make it happen, IT often does that. So, but we want to be really thoughtful about that. We want to make sure that we're not putting this entire burden on the IT team because it's not it's not just the IT team that needs to solve this challenge for the organization. So I will step off that soapbox, but it's true. It's true. So we have these broken out into technical, physical, and administrative. So from a technical perspective, we're talking about things like role-based access and least privilege. So role-based access is aligning individual user access with their role, and least privilege is limiting access to only the things that that individual needs to do their job. So role-based access is basically saying that I'm hiring someone new. That person that is new is in an engineering role. And as a result of being in an engineering role, these are the systems or applications or tools that they need access to. Least privilege is when I give someone access to this tool, the only data that they need in that tool is these 6 things. So understanding what those roles are, understanding what those privileges are, understanding how we're aligning that is really, really important. One thing that we see happen a lot in organizations is that we say, okay, so-and-so is coming in as an engineer. Well, Joe is also an engineer, so we're just going to copy Joe's access over. So here's the challenge with that, and here's what CMMC is trying to get away from. If Joe's been at the organization for 10 years and has held 4 different roles over those 10 years, Joe may have privileges. Maybe he's currently an engineer, but he may have privileges to systems or information that he has just carried with him that this new engineer person doesn't actually need access to. So what ends up happening is that we then give Joe information or Joe's access to this new person who then has more access than they actually need. So the expectation is that we're defining this based on role. We're defining this based on least privilege. As far as evidence goes, we want to have a role-based access matrix that says, these are the roles that we have, these are the applications that we have, and here's who gets access to what. And then we want to have a least privilege policy that says we only grant access to the minimum necessary access. Each individual user should have a unique user and device authentication, or we should have unique user and device authentication. So each user needs to have their own username and password, and each device needs to be uniquely identified. So you need to have its own identifier, whether you're using like, the MAC address of the device, whether you're using a serial number, it doesn't matter. You just need to be able to uniquely identify each device, laptops, desktops, networking equipment, USBs, whatever it is. And then each user needs to have their own unique username and password. So this is often one, the unique username and password is often one that we run into challenges with as well. So if you have individuals who are sharing access, who, let's say you have a machine out on your manufacturing floor that has a general login, machining 1, whatever is the login, and then everybody's got, the shared password. What the practice is requiring is that you can uniquely identify who is using that machine at that time. So this is the first time we have talked about compensatory controls, but essentially what we could do is we could create a shared if we absolutely have to. This isn't like your go-to move, but if you absolutely have to, if there's no way from a business process perspective to get around it, then you would just put additional controls in place, like a camera, for example. So if somebody logs in at 10 a.m. and we don't know who that is because because 6 people are using a shared login, if we have a camera that allows us to then uniquely identify that particular individual that logged in, then we can meet the spirit of the control. So as you're going through this process, this is where it's sometimes helpful to have, a registered practitioner organization or a consultant working with you, because there are multiple ways to meet these practices. So what we're trying to do here is understand who's doing what on the system. So in the event of an incident, we can identify who did what and what happened. The next piece is network segmentation, which includes a DMZ for public-facing services. So network segmentation just means that we are keeping key parts of our network separate. We are limiting traffic between certain parts of our network. So for example, if we have wireless access, we'll talk about wireless access. If we have wireless access, we want to separate out our production wireless with our guest wireless. We don't want our guests to be on the same wireless network as our server is on, right? If our server's on a wireless, or anybody's laptop for that matter. We also want to make sure that if we have things like our building management services like HVAC, if that is computer driven and that information or that equipment is connected to your production network, you want that segmented so that if somebody takes control, if somebody hacks into your HVAC unit, which are notoriously less secure than an actual server, you don't want them to be able to then travel on your network to get to that server. So there's some segmentation that needs to happen. If you have any sort of external facing services, so if you have a portal that you offer to your clients, if you have, if people can log into your website and get access to one of your databases, test results, that type of thing, you want to make sure that where that information is being stored is segmented from the rest of your network. So if that external facing device gets compromised, it doesn't then negatively impact the rest of your internal infrastructure. So that's like really technical goo, but it's important to understand from a leadership perspective and from a business process perspective. We want to make sure that we're understanding what information and what traffic is flowing on our network so that we can separate it, so that we're sort of siloing things so that we're protecting ourselves in the event that any one of those segments gets compromised. Media sanitization is another big one. So this is about data destruction and sanitizing media that we're no longer using. So we're getting rid of a laptop. We want to completely destroy the hard drive in that laptop. We want to degauss it. We want to, I don't know, take it to the shooting range, run it over with a bulldozer. I don't care, whatever. You just want to destroy it. You want to make sure that you are getting rid of that media and that you are getting rid of that data either before anyone else is using it or before we just chuck it in the trash. So that's an important piece, making sure that we understand what happens to data when we're done with it. This also includes paper data, which is much less dramatic than running it over with a bulldozer. Just shred that, crosscut shredder specifically. But any type of media that we're talking about, we want to make sure that we're sanitizing that so we're not accidentally exposing data for devices or paper that we're not using anymore. We want to make sure we have centrally managed antivirus and anti-malware. So the centrally managed piece is really important. The other piece of this requirement is that we have antivirus and anti-malware that automatically updates its definitions. The typical result here is that we have a cloud-based antivirus that allows for automatic updates anytime new definitions are released. So if you don't already have a centrally managed antivirus or anti-malware, that is something that you'll want to look at for a level 1. Patch management is the other thing that's incredibly important, making sure that we are patching the systems that we have in place on the information system. This will include the servers, this will include endpoints and devices, and any other device, even cell phones, tablets, that type of thing. You want to make sure that if they're corporately owned, that you're managing those patches and all security patches are applied as quickly as possible. Okay, so shoot me in any questions for the technical pieces if you have them. Physical access, so we can't lose sight of the fact that we have physical facilities and that there is information that could be valuable. There are devices that could be valuable to steal. We want to make sure that we have physical access controls and monitoring in place and that we have visitor management. So physical access controls and monitoring include knowing who is in the building, who's coming and who's going, who has access to what areas. There are different areas of your facility that are going to be more secure than others. So for example, your server room, if you have a traditional server infrastructure and you have a server room, not everyone should have access to that server room. We see a variety of different configurations when it comes to physical security of servers. If you don't have a server room, you want to put that server in a cage that's locked. Access is limited. If you currently have your server in a place that's a shared location, you want to try to resolve that. You know, it's not always easy to just like pick up a server stack and move it, but that's definitely something to think about in terms of limiting access to critical areas of your facility. If you have an area of your facility that is primarily data storage, you also want to limit access to that so that someone couldn't come in and gain access to your facility and take a whole bunch of paper documentation and walk away. For employees, we want to make sure that we're managing access control and that we understand when people are coming and going. The easiest way to solve this is using badges of some kind, key fobs of some kind to automate that management. There are some other ways to solve this that are a little bit less expensive on the upfront in terms of, technology and tools that you would need, but more intense on the labor. So there's definitely some ways to get that implemented. There's a couple different ways to get that implemented. Sorry. But we also want to make sure that we have visitor management in place. So visitor management is specific to individuals who are not employees coming into the facility. We want to make sure that we know what visitors are in the building. We want to make sure that we are confirming the information that, whatever they're there for, we want to confirm the purpose of their visit. And then we want to make sure that they're escorted at all times if possible. Okay, so quick question came in. Is there a minimum amount of time to retain recordings for CCTV if we use shared accounts computers? Yeah, it's a good question. So, so the compliance framework itself will actually tell you that you need to keep it for a reasonable amount of time to allow for incident response if needed. Super helpful, right? So our recommendation is no less than 6 months. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have that storage. You could actually back up the footage if you need to, or you could set it so that it just records, with motion sensors so that you're not like constantly recording. But yeah, we recommend sort of a minimum of 6 months. That usually seems like the most reasonable. But one of the challenges that we face in the industry and in the real world is that it often takes somewhere between 4 and 6 months for an incident to even be identified. So, so that's why we tend towards that 6 months. But the more you can hold on to, the better. But I probably wouldn't commit to more than a year. It just kind of depends on how much storage you need and how much your video is taking up. So, hopefully that helped. Okay. Okay. So administrative. So we talked about the maturity here in terms of process maturity being completed. We want to make sure that we've got these things in place, right? We're doing role-based access and least privilege. We don't necessarily need to have a policy or a procedure, but we want to have, some sort of role-based access matrix or some sort of documentation that helps us understand sort of what's what. From an administrative perspective, we do need to have acceptable use guidelines. So this is an employee-facing document that says this is what you can and can't do. This is what you should and shouldn't do on the information system. And then ideally, we want to have a network boundary diagram. So this is another concept that, at the very beginning, we talked about understanding what data you have. The other piece of this, which is really important, is to understand what your network boundary is, but then also what your security boundary is. Now, real talk, most organizations that we work with, they're the same thing. When it comes to CUI specifically, your network boundary is the external perimeter of your information system and everything inside of it. Your security boundary could be a subset of that information system that is defined only by the pieces of your network infrastructure that hold CUI. So in theory, if you are an organization that has 3 servers and 9 workstations, easy math, 3 workstations per server, and you can set up your business so that 1 server has CUI on it and 3 workstations have CUI on it. The security protections that we're talking about, you only need to apply to those 3 workstations and that 1 server. You could create a smaller security boundary that says this is where CUI lives in terms of how we function and how we store information. And then the other 2/3 of that, the other 2 servers, the other 6 workstations would be outside of that security boundary. Like I said, most organizations can't cut it that cleanly, just based on resourcing, just based on document storage, just based on business process and flow. It doesn't always work that way, but that is something that you could consider as an organization if you have the opportunity to segment it, depending on what portion of your business is DoD work or might contain CUI. You may have the opportunity to limit that, and the benefit there is just that there's often a reduced cost and a reduced cultural impact if you can limit the number of people, workstations, and servers that need to apply or that need to adhere to this type of requirement. So just something to think about. Like I said, it's, it may or may not work for you, but it's definitely an option. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Give anybody a chance to ask any questions they might have. Okay. All right, here we go. Level 2. Level 2, remember this is the stepping stone between level 1 and level 3. So this is where we start moving past basic cyber hygiene. We get past that sort of baseline of security practices, and we start moving into a more mature, moving towards that good cyber hygiene. Level 2 has 15 domains. Remember, there are 17 total. So level 2 has 15 domains and 72 practices. So we've added a good number of practices and a bunch of domains, 7 domains. I don't know, is that even right? 6, 7, 8, 9 domains? Math, not a math person. So we've added, so you'll see the non-bold items or domains are the ones that were also in level 1. So we've added these new domains. So audit and accountability, we start to see awareness and training, config management, incident response maintenance, personnel security. This is a good one. Recovery, risk management, and security assessment. So we're adding complexity here as we make that stepping stone, or as we make that step from level 1 to level 2. So process maturity here, these all need to be documented. So all of these practices need to be documented, and we need standard operating procedures, policies, and then plans. So we need a procedure that says, this is how we onboard new hires. We need a policy that says all new hires go through the onboarding process and the principle of least privilege and role-based access are applied. And then a plan says, this is all the responsibility of our HR management team. So let's see, we have a quick question come in. If we have multiple services on a server and one service contains CUI, do all services on that server require these controls? The other services do not hold CUI. So it depends on how they're separated out. If they're logically separated and the information can't flow from one service to another, then you should be okay. But I would probably just make sure that those are really uniquely separated. You want to make sure that if you are saying something is unique and only applying to a portion, you want to make it really, really clear that those portions, and I don't know how those are, if they're on different virtual machines, like I don't know if you've got different VLANs or how that works, but you want to make sure that those are totally separate so that there's no possibility of information flow between one or the other. Okay. Okay, so 15 domains, 72 practices. Here we go. Okay, slightly longer list here. Everything that we talked about in level 1 still stands. Still got to do all those things. In addition to that, now we move into the next phase here. So you can see our technical list is much longer. Our physical list is still in existence, and our administrative list got exponentially longer as well. So from a technical perspective, now we start talking about things like network hardening. We talk about things like encryption of data at rest and in transit. DNS filtering is required. Mobile code management. So mobile code in this case, according to CMMC, is things like Java and PDFs and ActiveX and a lot of the scripting tools. And then wireless security. We need to make sure that we have secure wireless. We need to make sure that we're leveraging WPA2. If you're aiming for level 3, we'll talk about that again, but ideally from a wireless perspective, you're going to want to look at 802.1x because you're going to need that network access control, limiting access and knowing what devices are connected. Now, this is the point in which I tell you a couple of things about CMMC that are going to be important to you to understand contextually. CMMC as a framework is, I'm going to say unintentionally, but CMMC as a framework is biased towards a centrally managed network-based infrastructure. So what that means is that there are requirements here that are specific to an organization that has a server, whether that's a physical server or a cloud-based server. Like, you have a central server, you have a domain controller, you have devices connecting to that server or those servers, and you've got firewall perimeter, etc. So it's a more traditional IT environment that CMMC leans towards. So if you are an organization that is fully cloud-based with no central server, no central domain controller, some of these practices are going to be a little bit more challenging for you to align with. And that is definitely something that, we're seeing more often. We're seeing a lot of organizations go for this fully cloud-based infrastructure, not centrally managed. So some of these things, just know that there is some bias there towards a network-based infrastructure. So sometimes, if you are an organization that's fully cloud, you may look at these and go, well, that doesn't really make any sense. So that's where we would leverage the not applicable potentially. But again, we have to be really thoughtful about, how we're communicating that and how we're providing that evidence. An admin versus a user separation. So no local admins. I know somebody just went, oh my gosh. And I'm sorry, but it's true. So there's an asterisk. I'll give you the asterisk, just bear with me. So we need to separate out privileged functionality with non-privileged functionality. We need to separate out admin accounts and user accounts. The practice specifically states that elevated privileges or admin accounts should be used exclusively for administrative purposes. So if you are an organization where individual users are local admins, or you have IT or engineers or anyone that's logging in and they have full privileged access, or if they're logging in with full admin access, we're going to have to revisit those requirements or that configuration. We're going to have to separate out that individual level of task. We're going to have to separate out privileged versus non-privileged. Now, I can tell you right now that this is a pain in the butt for a lot of organizations, because there are organizations that have individuals who need to function in certain ways. There are applications out there that are heavily in use in the manufacturing space that require local admin access to work correctly. So there's a lot of reasons why we would have individual users as local admins. So you might remember a little bit ago, we were talking about compensatory controls. This is a really great example of, as an organization, the way that we recommend implementing this and the way that we think about this is that where possible, everywhere possible, anyone who doesn't need local admin should have that taken away, okay? Anyone who requires local administration to be able to perform their job function should have both a standard user and an elevated privilege user, so that when they need to run something as an administrator, they can put in that elevated password. And then we need some additional compensatory controls. We need monitoring to understand when they're using those credentials. We need logs to track how often they're using those credentials. We need to understand what they're doing, that type of thing. At Mainstay, we have implemented this requirement in two separate ways. So we have network engineers that need to have local admins or local administration on their computer. I, on the other hand, don't need local admin access. So I don't have local admin access. The folks that do have local admin access, we've separated out their access control or their access. So they have their standard user and their elevated privileges. And then we have log monitoring. When we talk about level 3, we have a SIM solution that monitors that for us. So there's definitely protections that you can put in place to keep some of that where needed. The short version here is that this is going to be the first really hard conversation when it comes to separating out, especially from a cultural perspective. If all of your users are used to being local admins, this is going to be the first difficult cultural discussion where you have to separate out, like, okay, who actually needs this and who doesn't, and then, separate out that user access. So that's an important one. Configuration and change management are also going to be really important in terms of understanding how individual machines are configured. So the first part of this is just understanding what our configuration baseline is. So when we get a new computer, what are our baseline configurations? Are we putting antivirus on it? Probably. Are we enabling the software firewall? Maybe. Are we limiting local admin privileges? Maybe, right? What does that baseline configuration look like? And we also need to do that for things like firewalls, et cetera. And then from a change management perspective, if we're making changes to that, if we're making changes to the infrastructure, we need to document what changes are being made, who approved it, and when that change was made. We also start to require application whitelisting and blacklisting. So we're going to talk about whitelist and blacklist in a couple of different scenarios. So I want to be really clear about what we're talking about here. So there are two types of whitelisting and blacklisting that are required in CMMC. The first one is applications, and the second one is web traffic, essentially. Communication is what they call it, communication, whitelisting, and blacklisting. Now, from an application perspective, what we're talking about is defining what applications can be used on the information system and what can't. Now, simply by its nature, a whitelist is a list of applications that are allowed or permitted on the information system. A blacklist is a list of applications or types of applications that aren't permitted on the system. From an IT perspective, blacklisting is a lot easier to manage than whitelisting, partially because the number of applications out there is massive and incredibly long. And so there's no way that an IT team or anyone who's managing this for you could know all the possible applications. And so it does have a heavy lift when it comes to management. So typically we see people take a blacklisting approach, which basically just says that specific application types aren't permitted. Sometimes we block based on country of origin. Sometimes we block based on keywords. There's a variety of different ways that we can do this, but you need to have some sort of solution in place to make sure that we're limiting who can download what and who has access to what. So this is where we start talking about how controls tie together. So if we have application blacklisting in place, or let's say we have application whitelisting in place, but we also have individual users who are local admins, right? Then our blacklisting doesn't necessarily matter unless we do it at the firewall level. So we have to think about how we can put these practices in place and make sure that all of our practices are working together and we're not inadvertently creating gaps. Or when we do create gaps, we understand what those gaps are and we're compensating for those. At this level, we require VPN for remote access. As we get into level 3, and as we get into some of the higher levels of requirement, the recommendation here is to go for VPN. You could use remote desktop if that's what you already have in place. But our recommendation is that you start thinking about a VPN. And you can use the VPN appliance, you can use your firewall, however you want to do that. But the recommendation is that all remote connections, or the requirement is that all remote connections need to be encrypted. The recommendation from an overarching implementation perspective is that we look towards a VPN, just because it's the easiest way to get you where you need to go, especially if you're targeting level 3. Asset inventory, including removable media. So we want to make sure we understand all the devices that are on our information system. These are going to be laptops, desktops, networking equipment, USBs, external hard drives, backup tapes. I'm trying to think what else. Anything that's connecting to your network, anything that's part of your information system, you want to make sure that you have a clear asset inventory. The backup solution requirement requires that you not only have a backup solution, but you also are testing those backups and that those backups are encrypted. So again, looking ahead a little bit at level 3, we want to make sure that we have those backups. We want to make sure that we have one off-site and offline as well. So if you're replicating to the cloud, that should suffice as long as everything is encrypted. But at this point, level 2, we want to perform backups. We want to have a clear backup schedule. We want to have the ability to test those backups, and we want to do that on a regular frequency. Could be quarterly, could be weekly, could be monthly, could be annually, however you want to do it. But we typically recommend quarterly. It seems like a good frequency and a reasonable cadence. And then you want to make sure that those are encrypted at rest. And if you are replicating to the cloud, encrypted in transit. The next piece here is GPO hardening. So again, this ties back to that centrally managed network infrastructure. We want to have some group policies in place. There are some very specific requirements around group policy. You need to have a minimum password length. It doesn't tell you what it is, doesn't tell you what it should be, but it tells you that you have to enforce a minimum password length and complexity. You have to have systems lock out after a certain period of time of inactivity. Some organizations go for 10 minutes, some organizations go for 15 minutes, some are 30, just depending on your information system. There's, let's see, if you put in your password incorrectly more than X number of times, your account gets locked out. There's a security banner that needs to pop up when you initially log into the system. So there's a variety of group policies that CMMC requires. And so you'll need to have a plan and a process for documenting those, rolling those out, and enforcing those across the information system. So question came in, does CMMC offer guidance criteria for application and website blacklisting? No. Nope. CMMC, the CMMCAB, the DoD, they don't offer any recommendations on applications or tools or how you should solve these challenges for your organization, which it makes sense in some ways because there's any number of ways that you could do it. But at this point, there's not any really clear guidance as to how you should actually implement that or what tools. I would go through the assessment guide though and look at, I don't remember what specific practice that is, but I would go back through the assessment guide and see what they say in terms of how they recommend, what the examples are, that kind of thing. That might be helpful. And then the only other thing that I would say is that if you're looking for new applications, if you're looking for new tools, one of the best places to look is the FedRAMP marketplace. We are understanding, and this has not been determined or defined or documented yet, but what we understand is that anything that is FedRAMP moderate will be CMMC level 3 compliant. So if you are looking for a new tool, you could also check the FedRAMP marketplace just to make sure that what you're picking is on the list. So those are really the only two things that I can recommend at this point, but there isn't any specific product or solution guidance at this point. Sorry. Okay. Going back to our list of technical requirements, so a SIM solution, so security incident and event management solution may be required. So this is squishy at level 2, which squishy is a technical term for sure. It's squishy because the way that the requirements are written at level 2, you could in theory do what they're asking you to do with a manual review process, but it will be labor intensive. It will require resources. It will require time. It will require a really clearly defined process. So for some organizations, that may be the better way to go because a SIM solution could be a decent sized financial investment. For other organizations, they may just not have the time and they may want to go the option of a SIM solution. If you are going for level 3, you will need to have a SIM solution at that point. So it's definitely something to think about long-term as you're thinking about your longer-term strategy. But a SIM solution, when we're talking about a lot of these changes and a lot of these requirements, a SIM solution is on the higher end of cost typically for an organization. So that is something that will require more time in terms of understanding the impact of the solution and budgeting. So depending on where you are in your budgeting cycle, that might be something to think about for the next budget cycle. But totally up to you as an organization as to how you want to implement that. But there are auditing and log management requirements. Okay, multi-factor authentication. So we see multi-factor authentication at level 2. We also see it at level 3. At level 2, we have a requirement for multi-factor authentication for remote access. So going back to VPN, when we have a VPN, when we have remote access, we need to have multi-factor authentication as part of that process. So when you log into a VPN, you need to put in your username and password, and then you need to have that multi-factor authentication to go with it. The other place that you need multi-factor authentication for level 2 is for non-local maintenance. So if you are an organization that can log into your firewall remotely, for example, you want to make sure that you have multi-factor authentication on that. If your HVAC company has the ability to log into your HVAC machine that is connected to your production network, which it shouldn't be, right? Because we talked about network segmentation, right? You want to make sure that if they can log into that, that they have multi-factor authentication for non-local maintenance. So anytime that we're connecting into the information system from elsewhere, we want to have that 2-factor authentication enforced. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Additional locations for multi-factor when we get into level 3, but for right now at level 2, it's just that remote access. So a little bit of a heavier lift when we get to level 2. Some of these things are a little bit of a nuance when it comes to how you're managing your information system. Some of them are fairly low-hanging fruit, pretty easy to implement. Some of them are going to require some pretty significant cultural shift. So that's why we have the whole organization involved in this process so we can make good business decisions. Physical data protections. So you might remember in section 1 or level 1, we talked about having access controls. We want to make sure that we have a visitor policy. In level 2, we have to make sure that we're keeping track of those visitor logs, that we're keeping track of key management, that we are overseeing all of those physical protections, that we're reviewing those physical protections, that we're assessing those logs. We're making sure we understand who's in the facility and who isn't. We're looking for anomalies in those logs, things like, you know, Joe Smith came in at 2 a.m., which is highly unusual. We don't know what he was doing here. It's tracked on the access log, so we need to make sure that we review that and investigate that. So just taking your physical protections to kind of the next level. Not only do we have the protections in place, but we're also monitoring, reviewing, and reacting to what we're seeing. And then key management is another big one, making sure that we understand who has what keys, that we understand whether or not we're getting those keys back at the time that someone is leaving, and that if someone leaves unexpectedly or a key gets lost and it's a master key, for example, that we're getting the locks changed to ensure that the physical facility remains secure. From an administrative perspective, we start to see a much more significant lift here in level 2. So procedures need to be documented for all practices. So if we have a practice that says we implement role-based access, we need to have a process that says when IT is creating a new user, these are the steps that they go through to make sure that they have the right access that they need. We need policies defined for all practices. So the policy says all new users are guaranteed access based on the principle of least privilege and role-based access. And then the procedure says IT logs into this system, clicks here, sets this setting, right, based on the role-based access matrix, et cetera. If we didn't have a network diagram in level 1, which, like I said, we recommend, we want to make sure that we have network diagrams, that they're updated regularly. We want to make sure that we have data classification and that we have media labeling in place. So data classification, we've already talked about the difference between FCI and CUI, but we also have other types of information at the organization. CMMC doesn't really care about anything other than CUI and FCI, but if we're going through this whole process, we probably want to make sure that we understand what other data types we have and make sure that we're protecting them to the same level of criticality that we feel like they need to be at. So for example, for a lot of organizations, your intellectual property, DoD doesn't really care about your intellectual property, they care about their CUI, but if you were to sit down and think about which is more important to you, aligning with the DoD or protecting your intellectual property, they're probably equal. They're probably not different. Maybe your intellectual property is even more important to you. But in that case, you want to make sure that you're thinking about all the data types that you have and all the data classifications. We can't forget that the world that we live in has a significant amount of real world risk. So we might as well leverage these compliance requirements to make sure that we're protecting all of our information and not just the CUI information. So going through and understanding all the data that we have is a really important exercise. Personnel security, we have to make sure that we have formal employee training. We have to make sure that we have formal onboarding and offboarding procedures for our employees, and we have to make sure that we have background checks. Specifically, the requirement calls for personnel screening, but if you read the assessment guide, the expectation is that we're doing a background check. Now, background checks can be just a criminal background check. They can be, you know, criminal and financial and all kinds of other things. So there's a variety of different options when it comes to how you do those background checks. The fact that you do background checks is what CMMC is looking for. And then system and alert monitoring. So we want to make sure that we understand things like firewall alerts. What are we doing with those alerts? Where are they going? Who's reacting to them? Where do they live? How long do we keep them? That type of thing. So we want to start looking at system and alert monitoring just as a whole. And that could be constituted by a variety of different things, but we want to start that monitoring process. So, questions on any of that? Good, good, good. Okay. All right, are we ready to move on? Here we go. Level 3. Here we go. 17 domains, 130 practices. So every domain in CMMC is represented when you get to level 3. This is considered good cyber hygiene. And at level 3, we add asset management and situational awareness. So we want to make sure that we are managing all of these. So the process maturity at the bottom, we want to make sure that we're managing all of the policies and procedures. So remember in the last one, we talked about policies, we talked about procedures, we talked about having a plan for implementing those policies and procedures. At this level, we want to have policies, procedures, and a plan. We want to have oversight of that plan. We want to make sure that that plan is in place, that we're evaluating adherence to that plan, that we're adjusting if we're not adhering to that plan, that we have sanctions if people aren't adhering to that plan, that we've got resources and budget and everything that our organization is doing is supporting this plan that we have, this information security program that we have. So at this point, we're not just talking about actual, like, do we have procedures, right? We're not talking about sort of checking that procedural box. We're talking about oversight at the organization level. This is where it becomes a more broad business sort of discussion of who at the organization is going to manage this program for us, who is going to provide oversight, who is going to provide leadership and guidance, who's going to make these business decisions, and how are we actually going to manage that. So this is where it becomes important to have those information security resources designated so that everyone knows their roles and responsibilities. Okay, key components. So level 3, so level 1 plus level 2 plus all these things here. Now you'll notice that when we get to level 3, we don't actually have any more physical protections. There's nothing new at level 3 from a physical protection perspective. So at level 2, we've met all of the physical requirements that we need to meet to get to level 3. We do, however, have additional technical and administrative requirements here. Now, the technical requirements here are what I would consider to be more advanced security features. So these are more advanced implementations. These are more complex implementations. Some of these are more impactful on IT. Some of them are more impactful on your staff. So from a technical perspective, we have a SIM solution required. So we talked about the audit logging. We talked about understanding what's happening on the information system. So a SIM solution is required. The reason that's required at level 3, but potentially not at level 2, is because level 3 requires what's called log correlation. So at level 2, it requires that you gather logs and that you review logs and that you react to logs. Level 3 requires log correlation, which basically means that you take all of the logs from your information system and you bump them up against each other and look for weirdness. So if you think about, if we were to just grab a list of logs, right? So if we were to take let's say we have two separate servers, right? So if we look at our server logs and we say who logged into this server and who logged into this server, and we see like all the different logging, everything's good, right? When we compare those lists, what if we had the same person log into server 1 from Phoenix at 10 a.m. and log into server 2 from Tokyo at 10:30 a.m., right? Like that feels weird. But if we were to look at those individual lists independently, we may not catch that. But the correlation piece is what's required for level 3. Typically, the volume of logs that we're getting and the work to correlate those puts us outside of the realm of it being reasonable for us to have a staffing resource do this. So that's where a SIM solution comes in, because it uses automated technology and AI and all that good stuff to ingest all those logs. It correlates them for us, and then it just pops out any alerts that say, hey, this is weird, right? This is odd. You should take a look at this. And it's a lot of data manipulation. It's a lot of review. So there's still work that has to take place in terms of what alerts you're getting and how you're reacting to those alerts. But the actual act of correlating those logs is what becomes onerous and inefficient at best. Additional group policy and network hardening. So now we start talking about things like 802.1x. So on wireless network access controls, comprehensive encryption. Everything needs to be encrypted at rest. Everything needs to be encrypted in transit. So we're talking about all wireless communication. We're talking about encrypted traffic to your cloud providers. We're talking about encryption for desktops, laptops, servers, cell phones, any piece of infrastructure that is receiving, holding, sending, transmitting data. We need to make sure that everything is encrypted. Now, so if we look down, so we need a FIPS validated firewall, IDS and IPS. So when we talk about encryption, there are very specific encryption protocols, and CMMC does require FIPS validated cryptography, which just means that they require encryption protocols that are FIPS validated. Now, when it comes to firewalls, there are firewalls that are FIPS validated. We want to make sure that we're leveraging a firewall that's FIPS validated. An open question at this moment is whether or not wireless access points also need to be on that FIPS validated list. So if you go to Google and search FIPS validated modules, you'll find that list from NIST. And so that's an open question. So for wireless at this point, we're recommending a minimum of 802.1x as far as your encryption protocols. The question becomes whether or not your wireless access points need to be FIPS validated. Right now, as far as we can tell, the only FIPS validated wireless access points are FortiWAPs. So if you are not a FortiGate shop, then that may be something that you'll have to think about. But when we talk about comprehensive encryption, we're talking about all the things. Everything needs to be encrypted in transit, at rest, etc. So now we talk about communication whitelisting. So this is that web traffic, making sure that we are limiting how information is being transmitted and communication. So again, going back to the earlier question, there's not really there's a variety of different solutions you could potentially use here, but really what we're talking about is limiting and protecting what information can get communicated and how it gets communicated. We're talking about closing unnecessary ports, shutting off unnecessary protocols, that type of thing. So we're talking about really shutting down as much as we can and, being really specific about how information and what information can be communicated across that firewall. PKI encryption keys. We need to make sure that we have PKI infrastructure in place to protect those encryption keys tied back to that comprehensive encryption. We also have a note here to don't store user passwords. So this is something that we see pretty regularly at organizations. We do not recommend keeping a list of all of your users and all of their passwords. That is an insecure thing to do. I understand from a business process perspective, there may have been reasons in the past to do that, but we recommend not keeping those in a spreadsheet or not keeping those in a database. The only exception to that is if you are using some sort of a password manager, but even then we would recommend only keeping things that are critical to the business or for a business continuity perspective. Your information system shouldn't be set up in a way that, like IT, for example, needs access to everyone's username and password. So we need to make sure that we're not keeping that information on the information system, that it's kept either in your Active Directory as a hash, or that we're leveraging, individual users are leveraging a password manager for only their passwords, that type of thing. So that's potentially a shift for your organization and both your IT as well as your staff. We start to talk about advanced email protections. We want to make sure that we have sandboxing in place and email forgery protections in place. There's a couple things that I will say here. So there's a lot of conversation around email in general. There's a lot of conversation around Office 365. So if you have Office 365, the easiest way to meet these requirements is to get Defender ATP as part of Office 365. So that's the easiest solution. There are other tools out there that will do that. But the reason I bring up Office 365 specifically is because there is conversation in the industry around Office 365 GCC, which is the government commercial cloud, being required in order to pass a CMMC level 3 assessment. What we're hearing, and again, CMMC has done a really good job of not telling you what tools to use. However, in order to meet all of the requirements, the general thought process in the industry is that Office 365 GCC at a minimum is required. There are some organizations who are even recommending GCC high. Now, Mainstay on a whole is looking at CMMC, or for CMMC, we're looking at GCC, which we believe can be configured in a way that fully meets all of the requirements of CMMC. There are some other organizations out there that are recommending GCC high. The challenge that Mainstay has with GCC high is that the cost is exponentially higher than GCC. So there's no definitive answer on that. We have heard from the CMMC AB that GCC should be sufficient. But again, we haven't seen any assessments. We haven't seen anybody try to get a certification without GCC high, without GCC. We haven't seen any of that happen. So a lot of that is speculation, but just please know that that is something that's on the horizon. We're also hearing that if you are on G Suite, that is not going to be sufficient. So you will need to make a shift if you are on G Suite. More to come on that. We're constantly tracking that, and as we get further down the road, we'll see what happens with the Google tools. But at this point, the expectation is that they're not sufficient, and they don't give you the security features to meet the requirements of CMMC level 3. So all that to say, just start thinking about moving to GCC when you're ready. Mobile device management with containerization. So if you have individual users who are accessing any portion of your information system with CUI on their mobile devices, so if you have CUI in your email, right? If you get emails of documentation, if you get, specifications, if you get drawings, if any of that stuff lives in your email, if you get it from the outside or if you send it around internally, then you would have CUI in your email. So any individual who is accessing CUI on their mobile device needs to be managed. That mobile device needs to be managed with mobile device management. So there's a variety of different tools out there. If you use Apple devices, like Apple, if you have Apple Network, if you have Apple computers, if you have Apple phones, JAMF, JAMF is an option. If you use Office 365, Microsoft Intune is an option. Verizon has one. There's a couple different options out there in terms of mobile device management, but the specific requirement here is to have containerization. So what that means is when you implement mobile device management on a phone, that it segments out your business information with your personal information. Now to the user, it's transparent. So Mainstay has this in place. We use Microsoft Intune. It's transparent to me. There's not my function on my phone, what I do on my phone hasn't changed because I have Intune, it doesn't have any impact on my ability to use my phone. What it does is it segments my mainstay information from my personal information. So if I were to leave mainstay then can remotely wipe that container and get rid of all that information. So I can't take that corporate information with me. And that containerization requirement is part of CMMC level 3. Comprehensive multi-factor authentication. So now we're talking about multi-factor authentication for all the things. So level 2, we talked about remote access, remote management. For level 3, we also need multi-factor authentication for critical applications as well as local access. So when you log into your computer, if you are logging in and you are connecting to a network, you must have multi-factor authentication on that login. So that's going to be a shift for a lot of organizations. We have a variety of different ways to meet that. You could use something like a smart card. So some of you may already be using smart cards. You may already have card readers in your laptops or your desktops. If you use a smart card, if you just plug that into the machine, you put in your 6-digit code, that counts as multi-factor authentication. So multi-factor is something that you know and something that you have. So your PIN is something you know, the card is something that you have. When you remove that card, you're logged out of that machine. So it's important to understand that that requirement is in place, but it's also important to understand that there are a variety of ways to implement that for your organization. And so you will need to make whatever decision makes sense for your organization as to how you want that to work. But there is a requirement that we have multi-factor for remote access, network access. Privileged users need to have, if you're logging into a server, you need to have multi-factor authentication. So everywhere you're logging in, you should have multi-factor authentication. The one question that typically comes up is, what if we have a cloud provider that doesn't offer multi-factor authentication? So there's 2 answers to that. One, why the heck not? The first question. Second, is that cloud application holding CUI for you? Is it holding FCI for you? If it is, then we need to either revisit that vendor, we need to stop storing that information in there, or we need to change vendors altogether. But if it's not holding CUI and we can prove that it's not holding CUI, then I think it's probably fine not to have 2-factor, and you can continue to use that tool as you do today. So again, that goes back to that sort of network, right? That security boundary, network boundary versus security boundary. And then the last piece here is segment end-of-life products. So this is a requirement for any device, any system that is running an end-of-life operating system. So inevitably, I would guess probably everyone on this call has at least one machine of some kind that is running Windows 7 or Windows XP. I've seen some Windows NT recently. There's a variety of different systems out there. There's a variety of different operating systems. So the expectation is that if you have a system that is Windows 7, which is end of life, or if you have a system that is running Windows NT, that those devices are completely segmented from the information system and are not connected in any way to your production network. They shouldn't be connected to the internet as well, just from a real world risk perspective. But at a minimum, they need to be segmented from your information system. So that's a big deal. And that's something that organizations often need to sort of think through, because if you have an end-of-life machine that still needs CUI access because of what that machine is doing, and you can't connect it to your production network, you then have to figure out how you get that information. So that's where we introduce things like USBs. So if we have information transfer from the network to the device or to the test machine or whatever machine it is that can't be on the network, now we have to make sure that we've got a process for that USB. We need to make sure that that USB is part of our asset controls. We have to make sure that that USB is encrypted. We have to make sure that we're sanitizing that USB as appropriate, right? So it creates some additional process change that we need to be thinking about. But again, all these practices sort of work together and potentially against themselves. But in this case, we do need to segment the end of life or end of life products, and then figure out, if needed, what's a different way that we can manage that data flow. And then from an administrative perspective, we need a full system security plan. We need risk and security assessments. This is typically an annual process. Usually it says, the requirement says that you need to have periodic risk and security assessments. So it could be 15 months, could be 18 months, but we wouldn't recommend going much further than 18 months just because so much can change in your information system in that time. And then we also have to have, for those risk assessments, we need to have mitigation plans and oversight to ensure that those mitigation plans are implemented. We need a vulnerability management program, which means that we're scanning the system for vulnerabilities and we're keeping track of any vulnerabilities, systems that aren't patched or up to date, issues with antivirus, external vulnerability scans to look for any code flaws. If we're doing software development, we need to scan our code for vulnerabilities. So there's a variety of different things that we need to look at. We need to make sure that we understand those vulnerabilities and that we're reacting to them. And as part of that, we have what's called a security alerts and advisories requirement, which means that if you're using certain products, you want to make sure that you're getting notifications from those vendors in the event that something happens. We also recommend getting notifications from like DISA, the FBI, any one of the, all of those organizations, US CERT. They can send you updates that say, hey, this, we got a whole flurry of them recently with this Kaseya situation. So, right, this application has been compromised. If you have this application, you need to take the next immediate action, and it gives you some guidelines. So all of those things are part of vulnerability management. So now we're not in that phase of sort of just defending ourselves. Now we're proactively looking for those vulnerabilities so that we can close them before they have a chance to be compromised. Data classification, media labeling. So we've talked about these, but we need to make sure that we have everything documented, that we're reviewing that process of data classification, that we're reviewing all of our media labeling, making sure that everything is accurate and up to date. And then we need to have business continuity and incident response plans. We need to have roles and responsibilities. We need to have plans, procedures in place, and we need to test those plans and procedures to make sure that they work the way that we expect them to. And then the last piece is continuous monitoring. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're reviewing all of these requirements in an ongoing fashion and that we are, in general, managing the whole program and the process and making sure that if there's any changes that need to be made or if there's any gaps in our process, we're correcting those. Okay, one other thing that I want to talk to you about from a level 3 perspective. Technically, it applies at level 2, but this is another cultural shift that a lot of organizations, somebody, maybe the same person who groaned at me previously about the local admins is also going to groan at me about this. But please keep in mind that if you're putting all of these protections in place and you are managing all of these things for your information system, and you also allow people to connect to your network through a personally owned device, you're negating all the work that you've done. And as a result, personally owned devices prohibit you from being successfully compliant with CMMC level 3. So if somebody is logging in from a personal computer that you have no control over, no monitoring, you're essentially giving an unmonitored, unknown device full access, even if it's through a VPN. If that computer has malware on it, if you allow them access through your VPN, you could connect you could infect your entire information system and you lose control over any of the stuff that's happening on that device. So the recommendation is that no personally owned devices are allowed to connect to the information system. Now, I understand from a COVID perspective that a lot of organizations couldn't function if they didn't allow people to work from their personal machines, which totally get. But as you're getting ready to go through this assessment process, you're going to need to pull back on that, and you're going to need to make sure that that you're not allowing people to circumvent and that you're not allowing people to access from unmanaged and unmonitored devices. Sorry. All right. Okay, so really quickly, so level 4 is proactive. This is where we start moving into threat hunting. So we have 17 domains and 156 practices. same domains. In this case, the maturity is reviewed. Activities are reviewed for effectiveness. So now not only are we reviewing what's happening on the information system, but we're assessing each of our processes for efficiency and accuracy, and we're fine-tuning our ability to manage that program. And then for level 3, this is advanced and progressive. This is where we're optimizing our overarching plan. We're making sure that information is shared across the organization, that our list of users and all of the changes that we're making, all our change management is an organization-wide, highly communicated, sort of really focused program. And that in addition to that, we're also supporting the industry as a whole, and we're starting to act as an industry leader in terms of how we're managing this, helping to share some of those security alerts, that kind of thing. We're in that more proactive threat hunting, like we're looking for threats and we're looking to get ahead of them. So, like I said, we're not really going to talk about either one of those at this point. Okay, we're almost done. Thanks for hanging in there with me for this long. All right, so some things to consider. So first of all, you should evaluate where you are today. So the first thing is data classification. We talked about that, right? That's gonna mean the difference between level 1 and level 3 potentially. You want to make sure that you understand what data you have, where it lives, who has access to it, how it's stored, how it's shared, how it's deleted, right? All of that. You want to understand your technical infrastructure. Do you have patching in place? Do you have antivirus? Do you have multi-factor authentication? Do you have a FIPS firewall? Do you have IDS? Do you have IPS? Right? All of your technical infrastructure. You want to just take an inventory and understand, what do you have? How is it connected? How is it working? Right? All that kind of stuff. Log monitoring and auditing. You want to understand what logs you have. If you're doing anything with log monitoring at this point, or if this is going to be a brand new endeavor for you. You want to look at administrative controls. What do you have in terms of policies, evidence, reporting, oversight? We talked at the very beginning about each practice is going to require 2 pieces of evidence. So that's 260 pieces of evidence. What do you already have as evidence? What could you provide today? And what does that mean in terms of where you are and where you need to go? Training. Do you have training in place for employees specific to information security? So you may have a ton of training in place, but if it's all tied to OSHA and safety and on-the-job training and quality assurance and that kind of stuff, that's not going to count. We want to make sure that we have that information security training, information security awareness, and then some information on insider threat. Physical security controls. Revisit your building. Think about your building as to how would somebody break in if they wanted to? What would happen if somebody were to break in? Would you know? Would you know if paper went missing? How would you be alerted? If your employee, one of your employees came in at 2 o'clock in the morning and stole a bunch of information, would you know? Just revisit it, understand what your visitor policy is, understand what visitors are coming in, who has access to the facility. Do you have a cleaning staff that has unfettered access to the information system, to the facility, to the paper, right? Do they have access to everything? And they're unmonitored, they're just wandering around by themselves, right? Those are all things that you need to be aware of in terms of how your organization is functioning. Vendor management. What information are you sharing with your vendors? Who are your vendors? Do you have a comprehensive list? When we talk about vendors, the liability from a vendor perspective shifts. So if you have, let's say that you have a cloud-based ERP that you're using, and you're putting controlled and classified information in that system, as opposed to keeping all your controlled and classified information on your local server, right? If it's your local server, you have direct control over protecting that server. You have control over encrypting that server, right? You manage all of that. If you put all that information into a cloud, your liability changes from actually protecting that information to holding that vendor accountable to protecting the information to your expectations, which is a very different thing, right? Managing something directly versus holding somebody else accountable for managing it is a very different thought process. And so understanding where you have those situations is going to be really important in making sure that you're progressing to that level 3. And then continuous monitoring, making sure that we've got those policies, those procedures, audits, adherence. Start thinking about, like, who's actually going to do this work? Who's going to own our program? Who's going to take responsibility for this? And quite frankly, a lot of what we need to think about too is what happens if somebody doesn't? What happens if somebody fails to meet our expectations? What happens if information gets lost or stolen because somebody made a mistake, or somebody exposed information that they shouldn't have, or somebody didn't follow the security protocols, right? What are the sanctions associated with that? What does that look like? And then just think about it as a whole, right? That can all tie into your self-assessment and say, this is how far we need to go. But these are all some things that you should start thinking about, so you have a really honest and clear picture of where you're starting from and then where you need to go from there. So one thing to consider if you are doing CMMC research, there is this concept of allowable cost, which allows you to put in CMMC cost into new bids. So as you're bidding for new jobs, you can put in cybersecurity cost. Here's the thing. We need to make sure that we're reasonable about what we're putting in as far as cost. And we also have to remember that the expectation is that we're already aligned with 800-171. So if you have self-attested that you're aligned with 800-171 and you put in a bid that says, hey, I need an extra $60,000 for a SIM solution, you're kind of exposing yourself to say, well, what have you been doing up to this point, right? So you want to be thoughtful about how you're presenting that. You want to be thoughtful about maintaining those ongoing costs and making sure those ongoing costs are accounted for in your proposals, but that you're keeping in mind that the expectation is that you're already aligned with 800-171. And so some of those costs are going to be really closely monitored in terms of what your cybersecurity cost is as part of the overall bid. So just really quickly, so as I mentioned, Mainstay is a registered practitioner organization. I am a registered practitioner. 2 of my 3 colleagues are also registered practitioners, with the 3rd on his way through the process. We can help you with a gap analysis. We can help you complete that assessment and understand where you currently are. If we help you with a gap analysis, we'll align against both 800-171 and CMMC for you so that you have that information on both sides of the house. We can help with policy creation. We can help with pre-assessment consulting if you're at the point where you think you're ready to start going through or thinking about going through that assessment process. We can help with that. You know, we can work with you on recommendations for how we accomplish certain things. We do also offer full service IT and then full service information security programs. So for full service IT, it's one of the things that if you're an organization that has like a part-time IT, or if you have a small MSP, you know, 1 or 2 person shop that comes in and helps you with basic IT functions. If you have an individual who is part-time IT and then part-time engineer or part-time something else, we see that a lot. So one of the things that you might have to consider as you're working through this process is actually having full-time IT. So that's something that if you're interested in, Mainstay could help with as well. And because we have both the security arm of the business as well as the IT arm of the business, we our IT resources hear from me a lot. They're very informed on CMMC. So so it's a good match to make sure that, you know, everything's happening on both sides of the house as needed. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out for sure. So here's our contact information. But with that is just about everything that I wanted to cover. So I don't know, Eric, if you have anything you want to add. If there's any questions, please send those in. I'm happy to talk through whatever scenarios. I know I have thrown an obscene amount of information at you in the last, 2 hours, 2 hours or so. But if you have questions, send them in. If you want to reach out, please reach out to Eric. We're happy to help however we can.
Great. Well, thank you, Paige. Yeah, that concludes today's webinar, Cybersecurity for DoD Manufacturers. We will email you the slide presentation as well as the recording once we have that all set. Your feedback is also very important to us, so please complete the evaluation via the link I emailed you prior to this webinar. That's in those reminder emails I sent you. And then you can email, do the online webinar evaluation, and I will receive the answers. Just so you know, there may be funding in the future to offset some of the cost of CMMC Level 3, but at this point, I don't have any specific information, and it could be months away. but I will keep all of you posted. But if you're interested in moving ahead with CMMC Level 3 soon, please reach out to me at the email address there. I'll give you a better phone number. So please take this down, 603-724-0802. That's my cell phone. So you'll reach me quicker that way. That's really about it. So thank you everybody for attending today's webinar, and have a great day.